Welcome to Press On Podcast with Mike Woodruff, where Mike and invited guests share insights to cultivate a biblical perspective and thoughtful resilience in challenging times.
Welcome back. Today, I'm very excited to have a chance on Press On to interview Dr. John Dickson. John is an Australian who started life as a professional singer in a 90s rock band. He is now an author and a speaker and an academic and a historian. And I have been a fan from a distance and now realize that he is moved from Australia to Wheaton, to Mecca itself. He has come to the Holy Land here in the Midwest. So just by way of brief introduction before we jump in, John, Dr. Dickson earned an honors degree in theology from Moore Theological College and a PhD in ancient history from Macquarie University. He has held a variety of teaching and research positions, including being a distinguished fellow in public Christianity at Ridley College in Melbourne and a visiting academic at the faculty of classics at Oxford University. Currently holds the Jean Kwame Distinguished Chair at Wheaton College, where he is also a distinguished scholar in public Christianity. John has written 20 books, some of which have become documentaries on TV. In 2019, he launched Undeceptions, a new organization and podcast seeking to promote thoughtful Christianity in doubting times. Dr. Dickson, thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm really sorry that you had to read that long, boring introduction, but it's great to be with you. And yeah, it's great to be here in Chicagoland.
Okay, well, you know, in your world, which you sort of have, one of the things that I appreciate about you and why I'm was excited to have a chance to chat with you is because you have an outward-facing ministry. You are looking to reach those who are skeptics, doubters, confused, and perhaps have a shallow faith and are looking for something that's a little bit more robust. And so I think in that world, knowing that you've got some academic chops is helpful. So I have forced you to listen to that bio yet again. So. And as we were talking before we started taping this, I'll just say I have read your books and just sort of had you. So first of all, I had you confused for a little bit with the ABC reporter Dickson, who has some books out and was doing stuff. And I don't believe Christ follower, but I just sort of had you in this pseudo-academic, writing books, doing things on TV space, but I had you in Australia. And I really liked Humilitas, thought that was a very fun book. And I loved the introduction because I've used that kind of, when I'm speaking on humility, I've, just that whole walking into it to say, I'm sort of an expert on humility, which is a problem. But it's if I'm not an expert on humility, then why are you paying attention to what I say about humility? But if I am an expert on humility, I can't say that I'm an expert on humility. And so all I can say is that I understand how layered my sin goes. And when I'm proud, when I catch myself being vain, I'm then proud of how quickly I catch myself being vain. And eventually you just give up and you say, okay, this is what I'm thinking about. And you opened that book brilliantly, and I just thought it was very interesting. And I guess I'd like, before we go to Bullies and Saints, which I'll hold up, this is I think this is still your latest book. I know you've got something else coming out soon, but and I pulled the Doubter's Guide. If you could see this, which you can't, it's all marked up and bent pages and scribbled in the margins, and so that's obviously. Authors love to see that, right? There was some engagement there. Before we turn to Bullies and Saints, I'd like to hear, because I've cited this a few times, that you were part of a study of trying to figure out how the world pivoted around humility and how it went from being a bad thing, a weak thing, a sign of I don't know, not the kind of honor culture that the Romans were and the Greeks were, and you wanted to be strong. And suddenly people start to say, you know, we're sort of excited about humility. And you were part of some study, and I'll just let you say, what was that study and what exactly did you discover?
It was a study at Macquarie University, which houses the largest ancient history department in Australia. And it's where I did my doctorate, but it was a postdoctoral program that I was invited to be involved with, sponsored by the Australian government, one of those sort of government grant postdocs. And our proposal was to investigate various lines of evidence for the background of humility as a virtue, because it's been long noted that humility sort of explodes onto the Greco-Roman world as a virtue rather than being a weakness in the first century. And it's particularly around the Christian documents. And people had long suspected, we didn't sort of discover anything earth-shatteringly new. People had long suspected that Christianity had something to do with the birth of humility as a virtue. Now, the Greeks and Romans believed that you shouldn't be over-proud. They didn't like overbearing people, but they didn't use the word humilitas, the Latin, or the Greek tapeinos, both of which mean low, as in low to the ground. They didn't use that word positively. It was a word of negative connotations. The closest you'd get to a positive use would be everyone should be humble before the emperor, or everyone should be humble before the gods. Which, you know, for obvious reason, you should lower yourself before a superior.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of lowering yourself before an equal, let alone a lesser, was just unknown. And we were exploring various Greek and Roman texts, but in particular the Jewish texts, because there was a good hunch that Judaism was part of the story before Christianity that pushed along this virtue of humility. So we studied all the Jewish texts into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also the Greek and Roman texts. And the punchline, to cut a long story short, is that whatever precedents you do find in the Old Testament and in Jewish literature about God's love of the lowly, those who have been crushed, the low, the humble, whatever background that gives, it's really only in the New Testament and the early Christian writings that you get a positive use of humilitas and tapeinos as positive words, actually deliberately choosing to be lower for the sake of others. And the great text, and probably the turning point in Western ethics, is Philippians chapter 2, where in the middle of the first century, the Apostle Paul says, have the same mind that Jesus had, who was in very nature God, but humbled himself and took on the very nature of a human being all the way to a cross. And so this idea that Jesus, the greatest human, had lowered himself for the sake of others, inspires the use of this word, tapeinos, Jesus lowered himself, for a positive ethic. We are now to lower ourselves. And actually, if you track the use of tapeinos language, lowering yourself or humility language, by the end of the first century, it's exploding only in Christian literature. Outside the New Testament.
I don't want to geek out here on the Greek, but I thought that the Greek word was kenosis. I thought that we were talking about he emptied himself, and you're saying that the Greek word is lowered himself. I'm going to have to.
Yeah. Kenosis is there. Emptied is one word. And then it says he humbled himself.
Okay. Yes.
Tapeinos. Tapeinos is the word.
Okay.
Humility.
That was my in seminary. That was my first Greek assignment, Philippians 2, to translate that and write some paper on it. And I remember thinking, wow, if everything is going to be this deep and hard and profound, I am in for a long program. Of course, there's almost nothing that is that deep and profound. I mean, that great Christological hymn that you just, so much comes back to this, and to say, okay.
Yeah. And we get used to it. Christians get used to it, and they shouldn't get used to it, because it changed the world. Within a few centuries, even the emperors thought they were to be humble. Well, that had never happened. And now even our atheist friends think humility is a virtue. It's entirely because of the influence of the cross of Christ.
Well, let me turn to Bullies and Saints, and let me just ask, what's your book about? I'll give you the easiest slow pitch across the plate. What's your book about?
It's about the many bullies in the church and saints, meaning that colloquially, in every century. So it's a history that walks through the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, all the way through up to the terrible child sexual abuse scandals of the 20th century.
And 21st century, tragically, but well, yes.
Absolutely. Looking at the bullies and the saints, and it's a book for people, mainly I wrote it for people who think the church has only raped and pillaged, has only damaged the world. And that's an increasingly large number of people.
Right.
I wrote it for them to sort of say, look, you're partly right. The church has done terrible things. But here are all these amazing things the church did as well, establishing the first hospitals, the first charities, giving education to all, and so on and so on. The question I put to the reader is, which do you think came from the founder of Christianity? The raping and pillaging and wars, or the hospitals and poverty programs and education? And I think even the most ardent atheist today knows the answer to that question. The true Christianity is the Christianity that loves, not hates.
So I want to get to, I want to talk about the saints, and I want to talk about the response of those outside the church to the saints. But let me ask, have you gotten a lot of pushback, or any pushback, from Christians on, John, don't air the dirty laundry? Like, these are family secrets. This is around the kitchen table stuff, but we don't tell this stuff to our neighbors.
The only negative feedback that the book has got in reviews, formal reviews, comes from, ironically, conservative Christians, people like myself. So it's, but I knew that. I mean, my whole ministry has been, as a conservative Christian, trying to reach a very secular environment in Australia. And so I know that comes with some costs. Sometimes you let the team down, or at least it seems like you're letting the team down, because you've got to be honest with people. See, people have read up about the Crusades. They've read up about the child sexual abuse scandals. They've heard something about Martin Luther and anti-Semitism. And so it's just silly to deny that or try and say they weren't Christians. I mean, try and say that with Martin Luther. You can't. But he wrote a whole book that is the most obscene anti-Semitism you could ever imagine. So we have to account for that.
I was a college pastor for 8 years, and it always felt to me like there was a sprint to get to college, to the young Christians headed into a history professor, a philosophy professor, whatever, and to say, okay, I don't know whether you've got any sort of background on the dark side, the soft underbelly here, but I want to be the one to tell you about this stuff before you hear it.
Yeah.
I want to tell it to you and then try and frame this in context before you hear it from somebody who's trying to talk you out of your faith. And I just it feels to me like, let's just shine a light in the dark corners everywhere, and then point to Christ and say, yes. Yes. And as a pastor, I say to people when they say to me, the church has done some bad things, I'm like, you think you know the bad things the church has done? Good grief, I've worked on staff at a church for 30 years.
Yeah.
I know where some of the bodies are because I've buried some of the bodies. I mean, I wish it were otherwise, but let's just take an honest look at both the good and the bad. And I think that's an instinct that I really appreciate in you. And you write with such a light hand, it moves quickly. And I just appreciate, I appreciate you going after that.
Thanks.
Let me ask this. Let's talk about some of the bullies. So in the last couple of years, I've been hearing that the Crusades were perhaps not as bad as we have heard, and that the Inquisition is not. Recent scholarship on the Inquisition suggests maybe it wasn't millions and millions of people that were killed. Like I don't know that I thought it was millions, but I thought it was hundreds and hundreds of thousands. But you suggest that not that we want to hide from the bad. There's plenty of bad to find, but you've suggested that some of those stories that scholarship has changed their story on that.
Well, I mean, there are two cogs going at the same time. To take the Inquisitions, yes, there's been a massive revival of Inquisition scholarship, and that's partly because the Vatican only opened up the vaults in the 1990s. So people have been going nuts since the 1990s, and it's quite interesting that the Vatican didn't open the records before then, because had they opened it in the 17th century, all of the silliness about the Inquisitions would have just gone straight away, because the primary documents make clear that our best estimate is that 5,000 or 6,000 people were killed by the Spanish Inquisition over 350 years. Now that's 350 years of bloodshed that is a scourge and a stain on the record of the church. I'm not diminishing it, but that's 18 people a year. And yet somehow the Inquisition came to represent all that is most wrong with religion. Right. But, 17,000 people were executed in 9 months in the French Revolution. Right. So does that mean the secular revolutionary spirit is worse than Christendom because they killed 3 times as many in 9 months as the Inquisition killed in 350 years? Of course not. But it does make the point that the real problem is the human heart, not religion or irreligion. So the Inquisition's an interesting one. The Crusades you mentioned, again, I'm in two minds about this. I think I indicate this in the book. I am open to the argument that the First Crusade, particularly, was a just war, at least in the rationale for it. It was an attempt to go and take back lands that had been taken by Islamic aggression, and to protect the dwindling portion of the Byzantine Christian Empire over in Constantinople. And so it seems to me, if any war is valid, the First Crusade was valid. The problem is the Crusaders conducted themselves in all of the ways that defied just war. So they had a just war cause that they then perverted. Right. They slaughtered Jewish community along the way, for example. They killed women and children.
Let me jump in and ask you to define just war theory and reference that to Augustine, and just help people understand.
Yeah. That. So there was already in Roman society discussion of just war, and they basically came down to any war that is good for Rome and is duly appointed. But in that same mind, Augustine really did a lot of thinking about warfare, because Augustine, around the year 400, is of course at the point where there are enough Christians in the empire. It's not quite totally, it's not totally Christian, but there's enough Christians in the empire for rulers to want Christian opinions about warfare and so on. So Augustine began to write more about violence. And although he didn't endorse holy war, which the Crusades ended up being, they sort of took Augustine and went for it. But Augustine's view was a war is just if it is not the aggressor, it's always a response, a defensive posture. If it is conducted on the authority of a rightfully appointed authority, so it can't be a rebellion, and that it is proportional, that the response is always proportional. You don't have all-out war when a smaller war would achieve the same results. And he even said you should conduct war, if you have to conduct war, conduct it in a way that if you win, you don't leave the losers resentful of the way you conducted yourself. That's a high bar. And Christians followed that. They thought, okay, all right, so war is permissible under certain circumstances, but here are the rules. But the Crusades didn't do that. The First Crusade, they slaughtered Jewish communities throughout Europe on their way to the Holy Land, almost as practice. When they took Jerusalem, they slaughtered women and children, and that they're non-combatants. That's one of the first principles of just war, that you mustn't kill those who are not actually aggressors.
Soldiers, yes.
Yeah. So I'm left, I understand, like, there have been all these books written by Rodney Stark who says the Crusades are great, and people run off and say, oh, the Crusades are great. And it's like a revisionist history thing. And then there are those who say, oh, it was all just evil. I just sort of find myself agreeing with both and disagreeing with both. They were a just war in principle, and then Christians conducted themselves in a perverse way.
Got it. So let me ask this. You sort of keep the gas pedal down on the Crusades being, I mean, this is such a bizarre statement. The Crusades being bad, the Inquisition being bad, but perhaps the record being inflated. Perhaps it's not quite like Monty Python suggested in their movies, which is where most of us learned all our Middle Ages history.
Indeed.
Well, let me ask it this way. In writing this book, did you learn anything that was disturbing?
Oh, many things that were disturbing. The Christian riots at the end of the 4th century in Alexandria. Christians took to actually pulling down pagan buildings, going out in thug groups and beating people up. One group got out of hand and killed a famous female philosopher, Hypatia. And now it didn't have the approval of the bishops, and other Christians condemned it. But I was shocked to see that genuine Christians, or people who would look just like us in terms of their zeal for Christ, were involved in terrible things. I guess I was shocked by some of the behavior of great people that were also saints, like Saint Ambrose, at the end of the 4th century. He's the Bishop of Milan, and he was wonderful. He had been a Roman senator and governor, and then was asked to be the Bishop of Milan, which was quite a step down for him, still in the 4th century, but he did it. He was, humble. He was a poet, wrote wonderful Christological hymns. The poor loved him because he opened his own storehouses and convinced the imperial machinery to look after the poor. But he was a bully. Christians burnt down a synagogue, and when the emperor said Christians should repay for the building, for the rebuilding of the synagogue, Ambrose said, "No way, we're not paying for the rebuilding of a synagogue to Satan." And that kind of, moral blind spot in such a hero is very surprising. And it's a little bit like I already mentioned at the outset, Martin Luther. I had always heard about and read quotes of his 1543 tract, The Jews and Their Lies. But for this book, I actually studied it. Right. And I was in tears. I was in tears. My hero, Martin Luther, the rediscoverer of the doctrine of justification through faith, wrote the most despicable things about Jews in Europe and advocated the pulling down of their synagogues, the burning of their synagogues, right, removing protections from them in the forests.
Which comes up later in Nazi propaganda and other things that we've got. Yeah. Well, so I want to come back to that in a second, but let me flip the coin for a second. Who are the people that you write about that encouraged you? Like, who are and maybe this was a surprise to you, somebody that you did not go in thinking, oh, I'm going to talk about the good things, so I'm going to talk about, but you, in the context of writing this book, you found yourself encouraged by them.
Oh, so many, Mike, so many. I was surprised by Constantine, to be honest, because
Well, you
I
got
had
an
more.
Australian accent on that, so I'm gonna tell everybody that I refer to him as
Constantine.
Constantine.
Yeah,
We've got the Augustine, Augustine. I try to explain just so you don't add characters. So
Well,
Constantine, I like that.
yes, well, it's how it's said in Oxford and Cambridge, and therefore it's how
Okay,
it's said
well, there
in
I go with
Australia.
it. Sin and
So,
sin boldly. Yeah.
Emperor Constantine was more of a mixed figure than I had given him credit for. I'd usually come from the school of thought that, you know, Constantine wrecked everything by making the church an institution of power. But actually, he didn't. He didn't force Christianity on anyone. He actually allowed the church to be the church. He gave them the tax breaks that other community groups had, which allowed the churches to do amazing poverty projects. The church had always been doing poverty projects, looking after the poor, trying to free slaves and so on. But under Constantine, they were allowed to do it with great imperial freedom. So that was one surprising, but there are greater heroes than that, of course. Someone like Lactantius at the end of the 4th century, he's probably the one that convinced Constantine not to impose Christianity. Once Constantine became a Christian, he did not impose Christianity on people as a state religion, which he could have done as emperor. But Lactantius was the one who had argued that religion, faith, is a thing of conscience. And it's a sign of weakness if you have to force people into your faith. True faith comes through argumentation and persuasion. So I loved Lactantius. Right at the top of the tree, I think, is Gregory of Nyssa, around 374, who preached what we think is the first full-scale abolitionist speech. He isn't just saying slavery should be modified for the sake of the slave. He's saying the whole slave system is an abomination to God because even the slave is made in the image of God. His friend Basil the Great started the first hospital in world history, a hospital with 6 different centers, you know, for lepers, for the poor, for babies, and so on. And that started an explosion of hospitals throughout the Byzantine Empire and then throughout Europe. And the reason there were thousands of hospitals by, say, the year 1000 was entirely because of Basil the Great in the 4th century, having this great idea. Let's combine the best of Greek medicine, Hippocrates, Galen, with Christian compassion, the parable of the Good Samaritan, you know, the washing of wounds, the caring for the poor. And that's what they did. I could go into the Middle Ages, into the so-called Dark Ages, and we meet someone like Bishop Eligius, who was the greatest jewel maker of Europe, but then used his vast wealth to go and free slaves all throughout Europe in the 600s. And he taught that everyone who becomes a Christian must free their slave. And he would go to slave sales, purchase slaves, and then free them and say, you can either stay with me and I'll house you, or you can go back home, wherever that is in the world, and I will pay your way. This is a remarkable figure hardly anyone's ever heard of, but he influenced Europe in a profound way. In the century after him, Alcuin of York, who gave us schooling. He's the one who took the Christian tradition of catechesis, of, you know, studying the curriculum of the faith, combined with the 7 liberal arts, and established cathedral schools under the protection of Charlemagne, the great ruler of Europe. This Alcuin of York, who was a deacon of the church, passionate follower of Jesus. In fact, I just happened to be reading a book of Alcuin's prayers at the moment. And he was a full-on Jesus freak. It was just amazing. But he was absolutely committed to educating the rich and the poor, boys and girls. And he lifted Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages, if they even ever existed, and gave us the Carolingian Renaissance, the Renaissance that occurred in the 8th and 9th centuries. We could go on, but there are so many heroes that lifted my spirits.
So let me ask a question. You don't seem to settle the score in your book. I mean, obviously, you're writing as an apologist, or you're writing to you're writing to say, let's just look at what is out there. You don't come out and tally it and say, here's the, you know, net bad, net good. You leave that to the reader. Did you find that studying church history was a spiritual encouragement, or did it lead you to more, I don't know, despair is too strong of a word, but do you find yourself, having worked on the book, do you come away, yes, I'm glad to be with Team Jesus, or do you go, man, I wish we had raised our game?
Am I cheeky if I say the answer is yes to both? You know, like I often put it this way, that it simultaneously crushed any Christian triumphalism that was left in me and inspired me like never before to be like Jesus. Huh. And so it simultaneously humbled me and lifted me up. It's very strange. So, you know, the humbling thing is important, because actually, as I think about the terrible deeds of Christians through history, my thought nowadays isn't, oh, how could they be like that? It's more, I wonder what my blind spot is. I wonder what are the ways that I can't see that 100 years from now, people will look back on you and me and say, were they really even Christians? You know, the way we look back on slaveholders or crusaders. So there's that humility that comes out of history. But because I know, you know, people like Bishop Eligius and Basil and Alcuin of York and all these people, because I've got their examples, I know that Christianity can be lived. And when it is lived, it changes the world. Because as I said earlier, I don't need to come out with a score. I don't need to settle the score, say, you know, these points are bad, these points are good, because anyone can tell the Crusades do not look like what the Lord Jesus asked of Christians. But the hospitals of Basil the Great do. So the question isn't, have Christians participated in all the terrible things of humanity? The answer is yes. These things have always taken place in Greece and Rome and Babylon and China, everywhere. But what is the unique contribution of Christians to the world? No one could argue torture, warfare, bigotry. They've been everywhere. The unique contributions of Christians are hospitals, charity for all, open schooling, humility as an ethic. These are the unique gifts, because they didn't come from Greece or Rome or Egypt. They came from the gospel. And that's the key point, regardless of the ledger. Because Christians are, unfortunately, all too human. But it's the degree to which they pursued and attained love that is the remarkable thing in history. I think I say it toward the very end of the book. Bullies are common. Bullies are everywhere in world history, inside and outside the church. Saints are not.
Right.
And you have a preponderance of saints in the Christian movement, from, you know, the Apostle Paul right through to today.
Right.
That fills me not with a triumphalism, but with a zeal to emulate that model.
Talk for a second. You've got a chapter, the log in our eye, and I'm in particular, I'm sort of trying to figure out how personally to navigate these moments and how to pastor a church at this time, where and I think lots of things are going well, and I'm trying to say, look, lots of things are going well, but there are things that are going wrong, and we need to keep all this in perspective. But if you have, on one hand, a pacifism that is an isolationism, and on the other hand, you have a holy war engagement, and say, okay, I'm not looking to withdraw. I've all due respect to the Benedictine option. I think there's a lot there that I resonate with, but I like Wilberforce as a model more than I like Benedict. But it's a challenge to call people to that. And you talk a little bit about that. What would you say to Christians that are trying to figure out, how do I navigate the cultural challenges of this moment in light of history?
I was preaching about this in South Carolina 2 weeks ago, and my recurring phrase, my recurring theme is one that's really gripped me for a few years now, and that is, what the Lord asks of us is a cheerful confidence to enter the fray on everything, and a cheerful humility to lose well when we must. Those two things together. So we know Christ as Lord. We're the death and resurrection people. So we jump into everything. We'll go into every debate. We'll fight for every good. But when we lose well, with gentleness, with respect, with good cheer. We're slapped around the face. We smile sweetly back and rejoice. We don't act like the bully who gets slapped in the face and is outraged and bursts into tears. So it's that cheerful confidence combined with cheerful humility to produce a kind of confidence that enters the fray and is not afraid to, to be controversial, but at the same time is really pleased to lose well, because Jesus was the master of losing well. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek.
Right, turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
So let me ask, I have this sense reading your book and then looking at Bullies and Saints and putting it on the shelf and looking at all these apologetics books that I have. And what I've noticed in over 35 years of doing this kind of stuff is that all my the philosophy and science sections have gotten dusty and the history sections seem to be expanding. Is that me? Is that sort of the nature of the discussions on the apologetic front? I mean, and then I guess the follow-up question is, even a book like Dominion, Tom Holland's book, which and I saw that, I think I saw that Holland wrote. Did he endorse your book?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know Holland?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay. So my take is that he's not a Christ follower, but he's arguing historically about the Christian ethic and arguing that the critiques of Christianity are being made from a Christian framework by people who are throwing out the Christian framework. It just seems like things have changed a little bit, and I'm like, okay, these are different discussions than I was in the past, and I like them more. I'm much more of a historian wannabe than I am a science wannabe, so I'm glad for that. But is that a shift? Did you cause that shift, John? Is this all about you and your writing, or you're just surfing the wave?
I'm sure I'm surfing the wave, but I think it's true that new arguments are being brought to the fore without those old arguments completely going away. So it's really interesting. 25 years ago, people were saying, oh, the postmodern world doesn't want to know about science. They don't want to know about, facts and Bible proofs. They just want to know about suffering and pluralism, right? So we all trained to answer those new postmodern questions. But I always found that if you engaged people on the so-called postmodern questions and you did well, and they felt there was nowhere to go, they jumped straight back to the modernist questions of science and proof and so on. Whereas if you meet someone who's, all about the science, as soon as you give them a satisfactory answer about the science, they'll go to the postmodern ethics and pluralism and all those sorts of other questions. So my point is, I just think they're all in the picture. It's just that at the moment, the emphasis does seem to be on the way Aristotle thought of persuasion was that there's logos, there's pathos, and there's ethos. And logos is the intellectual dimension of persuasion, the good argument, rational argument. Pathos is the emotional, aesthetic, psychological dimension of an argument. We're drawn to what we think is beautiful. And ethos, in Aristotle's way of thinking about it, and I think it's quite profound, is the degree to which the persuader seems credible. And if you think of this in terms of the church, if the church is morally credible, it has force. But if it's morally lacking credibility, all of its arguments waver. And this is true in everyday life. I mean, the way Aristotle put it is that if you meet someone and they're a brilliant arguer, but you suspect they're in it for themselves, they don't have integrity, they don't care for your best interests, you're not going to be persuaded by them. But if you're sure they've got your best interests at heart, you're more likely to be open to them. Now, that insight, I think you find this all the way through the New Testament. It's why Peter said, always be prepared to give an answer, but with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience. So the ethical dimension of persuasion is key. And what that means is the bigger questions today are, has the church been a bully through history? And is it a bully today? Is its view of same-sex relationships detrimental? Is it harming us? The statements of the church about transgender, these are the ones that we need to be ready to give an answer to, because they go to the character of Christ. Now, I'm conservative on all of those things, but I can see why the average skeptic thinks that the church doesn't have a lot of credibility on a lot of these topics.
Okay, so John, I know that you are up against some time frame here, so I'm going to jump one last question before the lightning round here. Can you comment? Can you just tease out and frame the fact that we do have call it postmodern, call it whatever you want to call it. There has been a movement to jettison the Christian ethic, and yet it is largely on issues of justice that all these conversations are taking place. And I had somebody recently say, you don't understand Nietzsche like you think you do, which I suspect is very true. But I have tried to look at some of the postmodern writers, Foucault, Diderot, who have argued that who have argued from a different framework than seems to be in place right now when we're having everybody get canceled and these standards that are being set in place. And it does seem to me, when I ask people, on the basis of what are you arguing this? And I just printed out, I haven't read Pinker's article, The Stupidity of Dignity, in which he's arguing, like, look, no, there's no inherent dignity to humans. You can't say that. And I go, well, I think everybody thinks that there is.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to, I'm trying to tease out what's going on here. Is that part of what you have seen change as a historian looking at the discussion?
There's a massive turning against the superstructure and organization of Christianity and Christendom, while clinging to a core Christian idea about human dignity. I mean, because it is human dignity and equality that is driving all of these complaints about the church, about church history, about the church's culpability in slavery and racism, transgender rights. All of this simultaneously borrows the Christian principle of dignity, everyone made in the image of God. Even if they don't believe in God, they believe that everyone has the dignity one would assign the image of God. And yet all of this is directed against the church. And it's a very interesting question and an open one, and one I have put to Tom Holland himself. And it's quite interesting to hear his response. I said, okay, so people are turning against Christian superstructure and the church while maintaining this ethic of justice and human dignity. Will there come a point where they realize that actually you can't even argue for human dignity and justice without the Christianity that we're criticizing, that this is the basis historically and metaphysically for our belief in human equality and so on? And Tom said, he said, it's too early to tell, but he said there's only one time in world history when a culture deliberately turned itself against the very premise of Christian theology and anthropology, and that is Nazi Germany.
So it seems to me like this is what Nietzsche was talking about a little bit. When we when everybody is saying that at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, it's going to be glorious and science is going to fix everything and we're going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and share. Nietzsche said, you guys you're idiots. As soon as the halo of God and love and dignity goes away, the 20th century is going to be a bloodbath. And so then you do get the Holocaust and you get Stalin and you get all of this. Now, again, we've got our own skeletons in the closet, but the argument I think that we make is we make our mistakes when we don't follow what Jesus says. And these are the mistakes that you're heading down, or the bloody path that you're heading down, the just get at power. That's sort of consistent with what you are saying is true.
Yes. And Tom Holland added in that conversation I had with him that one of the interesting effects of Nazism and the Holocaust is that people were so horrified by that, it probably gave us decades more of people clinging to human dignity. They saw the depths of what happened, and they didn't rush back to Christianity, but they did cling to, in a fresh way, this principle at the heart of Christianity that every human has dignity.
Right.
But his point was, I don't know how long that can last, and nor do I.
Right. And I guess I find myself conflicted. I want people to say humans have dignity.
Yeah.
I just wish they would ground it in something other than it seems to come out of the ether for them.
Well, and it's a wonderful conversation piece with a friend that you trust, a skeptical friend you trust. If you can really get some time with them, say, look, you believe every human has dignity and everyone's equal, right? Yes, of course I do. Can you tell me what's that based on? And just let them try and tease it out. I've had the most marvelous conversations with skeptical people on just this question, where they slowly come to their own realization. You can't ground it in anything if there isn't a God who is the good that has produced us with intention, that is intentionally produced us. It's the only thing that can ground any idea of human dignity. So I would encourage people to have that conversation.
Yeah, they talk themselves into a room in one argument, whether they realize that that's what it is.
Very
okay. I do want to honor your time. So 3 quick final questions here. What are you reading right now?
Alcuin of York's.
Besides the prayers of Alcuin of York.
Prayers, The Age of Vikings.
Oh.
And After Humanity.
Oh, I don't know that book.
By Michael Ward, the great C.S. Lewis scholar. Yeah.
Oh, okay. What book have you been recommending? What book, other than the Bible, or what podcast, or what TV show, or what is it that you have found yourself pointing people to in the last year more than anything else?
It's a difficult book to read, but I do think the most important book to be published, and probably will be for a decade, is called Biblical Critical Theory by Christopher Watkin.
Okay. Yep.
It is a remarkable, and despite the title, I know that freaks some people out. What? It's a critical theory? No, it's showing that the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is the ultimate critical theory. That is the ultimate thing that undermines powers, that challenges the world and affirms the world. And it's written by someone who's not just very knowledgeable of the Bible, but is an expert in modern European philosophy. So he knows all the Foucaults and the Jean-Paul Sartres and the Nietzsches, and he interacts with them, but offers a Genesis to Revelation account of what the Bible says to our modern culture. It is stunning, but it is not easy. And
it's 700 pages, I think.
It is.
Yes. Happy day. Okay. Final question. What are you working on now? I think I saw that Persuasion from Aristotle to Apple is about to roll out. Are you working on something beyond that at the moment?
Yes. I'm working on a book that is tentatively titled Weird and Wonderful. So it's a little bit like Bullies and Saints. And it's a history of the wacky things Christians have believed through history, And the way they always keep coming back to 175 words in the Nicene Creed, the only creed that is accepted by Protestants,
Right, Catholics,
and Orthodox.
Yeah.
It's the only 175 words in the original Greek. And
provided that we leave the filioque clause alone.
So long as you leave 2 words out. Yeah.
Okay.
But that, I will explain that. And so really it's a book for doubters, again, explaining the Christian faith through the Nicene Creed, the doctrine of the Father as the creator, the Son as the Redeemer, and the Spirit as the life giver.
Are you, so are we looking at you in your office? Where are you, at home? Are you in a study?
Yeah. I'm here in my Wheaton College office. Out there is the beautiful campus, and right in front of me are all my books. And this is Monet behind me.
Okay, so yeah, it's the Monet behind you. I'm wondering if you are am I right that you're an artist at some point? Are you a musician? Are you?
Yeah, I'm a musician. So I was a professional singer and songwriter for 6 years. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I am. I thought maybe you were a guy I could talk to about beauty. It seems to be coming on.
I have lots of thoughts about beauty, but
okay. Well, I suspect you do. Maybe that's the next podcast.
Maybe.
So, John, thank you. I know you've got a hard stop. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your ministry.
Thank you, Mike.
Your books. Look forward to many more. And perhaps our paths will cross here, since you're not down under and you're just at Wheaton. So
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bless you. Bye-bye.